das ist ein anderer. Der Liturgy in Diaspora war gestern. Heute brauchen wir den anderen, den zweiten.
Das ist vom 5. Hier steht 25.01. Frau Silviu N. Bunta.
Aber das Thema ist jetzt der Lord to make. Das ist ja das.
Das wurde angelegt für den 25.
Nein, auf
von
unserer
der.
Homepage steht da, it's time for the Lord to make.
Achso, ich habe jetzt. Ich habe das falsche Bild.
Das ist das falsche Bild, das man nimmt.
Okay.
Das Bild ist vom gestrigen.
Okay.
Das heutige hat ein anderes. Das ist auf unserer Homepage drauf.
Ja.
Sie schauen UKK und Wien. Was geht runter? Dann kann man es gleich.
Sekunde, Moment, das ist nicht so einfach. Ich mache das ein bisschen anders. Wir haben hier. Schauen wir rein.
Aber kommen Sie zu Ihrem Bildschirm hin?
Ja, ich sollte das eigentlich runterladen können. Hier, genau. Ah, das ist schon wieder das Falsche. Wieso macht er das? Ich habe den 25. angeklickt. Ah, da haben sie auch. Ah, die hat ein falsches Bild hochgeladen auf YouTube. Was ist Ihre Homepage?
OKK Uni Wien.
OKK Uni Wien?
Uni Wien. Dann kommen Sie gleich hin auf unsere Seite. Ostgegenrunde.
Das?
OKK Uni Wien. Ostgegenrunde.
Ja, OKK.
Uni Wien und dazwischen ein Abstand. Dann kommen Sie auch zu Wien. OKK ein Abstand. Da, die Begegnungsgeschichte jetzt bitte. Müssen wir uns das anbieten?
Ja.
Dann kommen Sie gleich da unten auf das drauf. Ist da aufdrücken?
Ja, da kann ich mir das Bild nicht runterladen. Jetzt sind wir schon live.
Achso, das ist jetzt schon live.
Wir sind schon so.
Aber das können wir ja nicht auf dem Bildschirm lesen.
Was?
Das Live-Team können wir nicht auf dem Bildschirm lesen.
Nein, das geht nicht. Also wir können jetzt auf den Bildschirm
auf dem Bildschirm noch einmal in die UKK-Seite zurück. Und dann können wir zumindest von dem klicken Sie das an. Diese Startseite von dem oder schauen Sie da drauf. Und da ist der dann. Nein, nicht draufdrücken, sonst kommen wir auf seine Homepage.
Ja.
Das ist sozusagen das jetzige.
Das kann ich jetzt auch nicht in Stream. Ich kann nur ein Bild mir runtersaugen und das dann in den Mischer.
Internet verbunden ist. Das ist nicht mehr Laptop, sondern der Kanal.
Nein, ich verstehe mich nicht.
Ich könnte ja da sozusagen.
Das können Sie machen.
Aber ich weiß nicht, ob ich dein Internet habe.
So.
Achso, das ist schon.
Genau, das könnten
Aber das muss ich dann runter scrollen. Was für eine Chance. Was für eine Chance.
Ja.
So, good evening. Dear ladies and gentlemen, present here or listening online, Your Excellency, dear colleagues, welcome here at the Catholic Theological Faculty of the University of Vienna. We are here participants of the international workshop, The Lived Byzantine Liturgy Between Local Context and Standardized Tradition. And I am glad that we can listen now to the second keynote speech. I also think that online audio is working now, so you can also follow us. The speaker today is Father Silviu Bunta. Thank you very much for coming, and let me introduce you briefly. On his homepage, Father Silviu writes that he is a mostly retired professor of early Judaism and Old Testament, but as we will see now, very active as a translator of early Christian text and Orthodox liturgy. Father Silviu grew up and lived in Romania before moving to the United States. He studied early Judaism and ancient Christianity at Marquette University, and has taught as a professor at the universities of Dayton, also Marquette University, St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary, and in other different institutions. He serves as a priest of the OCA, Orthodox Church in America, retired in 2022 from his tenured position at the University of Dayton, but has a lot of research projects, mostly translations, critical editions of texts like the Romanian recension of the life of Adam and Eve, for example. And Father Silviu is also active in the ecumenical movement, so he was also the OCA representative of the Faith and Order Commission of the World Council of Churches, or is it now still, if I remember correctly. So the early Judaism and Jewish pseudo-epigraphs of the Old Testament, early Christianity, are his main focus of research, and he has a PhD in Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, the Marquette University, and a master in Hebrew Bible, Old Testament of the University of Oradea in Romania. But today his main focus is liturgy, and the title of his presentation is "It is Time for the Lord to Make Thoughts on Translating the Liturgy with an Eye Towards Being Made." A very interesting title, and I'm looking forward to your lecture. Thank you for coming.
Thank you to all of you for being here. Thank you to all of you who are joining us online. I also wish to express my gratitude to our and my generous hosts, the Catholic faculty of the university, the organizers, Professor Thomas Nemeth, Mrs. Daniela Whittle, the Dean's Office of the faculty, who is actually hosting us, where you are here on its premises, and everyone. So thank you. Indeed, I chose a title with a play on words. I spelled it as a capital I, but of course, and you'll see why, because my point is that the liturgy wants to remake us, to change the human being, the liturgizer. But when it is pronounced, it sounds very much like the organ, the I. Allow me to begin this contribution to our workshop with some observations on how I see the Byzantine liturgy. I do not wish to steer our focus away from the issue of translation, but my points on translation will be informed by what I think the Byzantine liturgy is. And this point itself must be prefaced by a disclaimer. I am not a liturgist. By now it shouldn't come as a surprise since you heard Professor Nemet's introduction. Rather, I'm a researcher of the scriptures. Nevertheless, about 10 years ago, I was emboldened to translate the Byzantine liturgy, specifically the liturgical books of the monastery of Simonopetra and also the Psalter, which are mostly done and published by now, by a sense that from the perspective of this liturgy, even in all its flux, itself and the scriptures are one and the same thing. In most of my translation efforts, I have had collaborators, especially my friend, Father Matthew Peter Butry, and of course, His Eminence Archbishop Alexander Golitsyn, who is my bishop now, but also was my professor and academic advisor in my studies of early Christian mysticism, because before I switched to the study of Judaism, I started my doctorate in patristics, and I was a student of patristics for 2.5 years, actually. I know that they too see things quite similarly to the way I do, if not even identically, but I can speak here only for myself, of course. And my personal translation philosophy and practices have always drawn on my sense that the Byzantines who gave us the liturgy saw scripture and liturgy as one and the same thing. And I will elaborate on this. The scriptural character of the Byzantine liturgy has been highlighted for many decades now, and studies on this are being published every year. In a book which will appear soon, I'm doing the final corrections suggested by the anonymous reviewer, I'm arguing that the Byzantine liturgy in all its dimensions, words, architecture, gestures, times, orientation, iconography, in all its dimensions, presents itself as the real time of the scriptures. In worship, it is not that the participant brings to mind all things, or things of old, if you wish. It's not that he informs himself of what the scriptures say, or even that he reactualizes the past and anticipates a certain future. On the contrary, from the vantage point of the Byzantine worship, the scriptures have no life of their own as a past reality. Rather, there is no past. In the liturgical here and now, history and space are exposed and increasingly removed as one goes through the liturgical experience as mere veils over the perennial singular and sudden reality, which is Christ. And this liturgical reality, and in this liturgical reality, one lives all the scriptures and the entire life of the world at once. The way I like to put it to my graduate students, quantum physics has got nothing on us. The liturgy is the actual space-time of the scriptures and of all reality. It seems to me that this is true to the point that if we cease to serve Vespers, which is of course the rite which contains the creation of the world would not have been created in the first place. Of course, chronology notwithstanding. In a converging move, recent studies on the Byzantine sacred space and iconography have pointed out that these are not conceived as flat message givers, but rather as spaces of identity unraveling. What does this mean for the liturgical text itself, especially when it is approached with concerns for meaning? Allow me to return once more to the scriptures. Others before me have drawn attention to the fact that the principal questions which we tend to ask of the scriptures today, what does this text mean, and what is the method by which I arrive at what it means, these questions depart from the questions and concerns governing the earliest interpretations, which, it must be pointed out, are also the interpretations that have generated the Byzantine liturgy. These early interpretations can be summarily gathered under the question, how is this text space containing and transforming my life. I have already argued elsewhere that the self-referential hermeneutic of this radically different question comes out of the scriptures themselves in one bidirectional move. The scriptures do this experiential referential hermeneutic or exegesis in the manner in which they want to be interpreted and in the manner in which they interpret themselves. In other words, in which later scriptural texts interpret earlier texts. There's a growing body of literature on this. This latter prospective direction has already been noted in recent scholarship, as I said, and has been aptly called inner exegesis. I proposed somewhere else that we call the prospective direction of the scriptures outer exegesis. In other words, the scriptures don't come as a blank text, but as a text that solicits a certain approach. It seems to me that the liturgical text, too, reveals the same referential outer exegesis as speech in search of speaker. To put it simply, the liturgical text has a hermeneutical pressure of self-referential appropriation and wants to be read, as it were, as a space in which one's life is contained and made, not as a text which says or means, but a space-time which creates, or rather a space-time which is life itself. Therefore, the program, as it were, of reading liturgy is ascetical erotic, to use Dionysian words, and I mean them in the Dionysian sense of these words. I would even venture to say that this is the case to the point that the methods which needs and inclinations for analytical and definitional clarity can possibly muster will only obscure the language of the liturgy through their promised clarity, precisely to the extent to which they are successful. And therefore, just as the liturgical text, together with all the other dimensions of the Byzantine liturgy, I might add, solicits this ascetical reading, frustrating attempts at nailing it down discursively, or in other words, just as it creates a certain liturgizer, and this creation is its interpretation, it also refuses translation approaches which privilege procedure and observational distance. To rephrase this last point in the positive, the Byzantine liturgical text solicits a translation which does not start by asking procedural questions, lexical, grammatical, or conceptual, but rather begins with a willingness to fulfill the liturgy's own outer exegesis, which a willingness to be made or created, or to be remade or recreated. This conviction has led me to my translation philosophy, which I'm actually submitting to you this evening. In a nutshell, I would put it this way: a translation which meets the text's own expectation, keeps and does not alleviate the ascetical pressures of the text, the birthing pains through which the liturgy puts its liturgizer. The liturgy ought to make in translation what it makes in kini. Sorry for the Greek pronunciation of Greek, so I pronounce it in the Greek way, not koine in Erasmian. In other words, the liturgy ought to make in translation, namely to engender the same life as it did in kini. While mindful of the fact that the Byzantine liturgy puts out this creative process through all its dimensions at once, not only through words, but also through icons, through gestures, through orientations, as I mentioned, through architecture. The text itself, and I'll focus on the text itself for the rest of my talk, uses for this strategy certain, what I would call outer ascetical features, among which arguably the most prominent are the following. First, incompleteness. Second, bad or non-idiomatic Greek. Third, blunt, rough, or inelegant Greek. Fourth, ambiguity or polyvalence. And finally, fifth, spatializing. I will get to this one by one. It is worth considering, though, before I do that, briefly at least, the fact that before they employed them in their own liturgical text, the ancients detected these same features, which they often, by the way, called difficulties, as you know, in the scriptural text, and saw in these features of the scriptural text the places in which the scriptures are the most scriptural, in which the holy text thickens, or to put it in a different way, as we're all waiting for dinner, the fattest and juiciest parts of the holy text. For the rest of my talk, I will be analyzing, as I said, the above 5 features with an eye, and that's the play on that word, toward an English translation. But of course, the points I'm making here can also be made in relation to other languages, although the particular applications will differ from language to language, sometimes, of course, even greatly so, at least conceivably. Each translation effort, in my opinion, will have to decide for itself how to keep these and other difficulties of the Keynote text. But, in my opinion, they ought to be kept. I'm appealing first to incompleteness as a feature of the liturgy's aforementioned pressure on the liturgizer to be transformed for 2 reasons. First, it is quite rare, and by the way, it's also very easy to miss. And second, it is extraordinarily important. A well-known case is the following phrase from St. John the Golden Mouth's prayer of offering. And it came up earlier in our workshop. Prosagage to agiosu disiastirio. Bear to your holy altar. There is no direct object for the verb bear in Barberini 336 or any other early and or significant manuscripts. So the natural question is, what is God to bear to his altar? Indeed, the clause feels incomplete, and without exception, the direct object is supplied in English translations. The Antiochian Archdiocese of America, or North America, and also the Greek Archdiocese of Great Britain have us. But most English translations have it, such as the Greek Archdiocese of the United States, the Greek Archdiocese of Australia, and the OCA, the church to which I myself belong, at least the official translations of the OCA. The latter, it, bear it, reproduces the direct object of the immediately antecedent clause, which refers to our sacrifice. So bear our sacrifice to your holy altar. The former translation follows actually suggestions by Juan Mateos and Robert Taft, Father Robert Taft, and anticipates the direct object of the immediately subsequent clause, enable us to offer. So bear us to your holy altar. I disagree with this option for us for several reasons. Not only because it makes bad Greek, it does make bad Greek, but many others. But I will not review them here. Yet, even my own preference for it is indeed on shaky ground, I have to admit. Or rather, the problem is that it makes stable the ground which is unstable. And this is a serious mistake, because ultimately, in my opinion, the instability itself is the point. At this point, it is important that we acknowledge the fact that the kini of our prayer does not read any less incomplete without an explicit direct object than an objectless English translation, bear to your holy altar. I'm not aware of any studies, as of yet, to explore the significance or value of incompleteness in liturgy. So actually, this talk might be the first one, for all I know. Yet, thankfully, the liturgy shares this feature with the scriptures. And in the scriptures, the feature is even more prevalent, and there is increasing attention to it. My point on incompleteness can be made on only one scriptural text, which is so thick with it, which I also analyzed at length in a recent article, Exodus 19:25 through 21, 2 sequential verses. These verses open and set up the entire Sinai covenant, and in both the Masoretic and the Septuagint recensions, they read as follows. So Moses went down to the people and said to them, period. And God spoke all these words, saying, and then God starts giving the covenant. Both verses are peculiar in the same way, as incomplete. In the entire Old Testament, the first verse is the only case in which the Hebrew and Kini verbs amar and ipon, respectively, lack a direct object, stated or implicit. Actually, more often than not, the Hebrew and Kini verbs introduce a direct speech. If you say said to them, you have to tell me what this person said to them. In regard to the second verse, 21, the renowned early Judaism scholar Benjamin Sommer makes the following observations on the Hebrew text, but they are equally valid for the Greek text. Quote, this sort of phrasing, namely God or the name, spoke or said, saying, is exceedingly common. Verses with the subject God or the name and the vav consecutive verb spoke or said occur 339 times in the Bible. Of course, he means the Hebrew Bible. In every occurrence other than this verse, Exodus 21, the text uses the word el or the particle le, both of which, by the way, mean to and introduce an indirect object, to tell us explicitly whom God addressed, such as God said to Moses this. Only in this verse is there any doubt about the recipient of divine speech. This fact is jarring to an audience whose ears are familiar with the hundreds of cases of the normal form, end quote. Thus, in Exodus 19:25 and 21, we have two consecutive incomplete texts, lacking a needed direct object, the first one, and a customary indirect object, the second one. Sommer and others have taken this situation as a problem to be solved and proposed different solutions, which they themselves admitted to be unsatisfactory. My contention has always been that the two verses need no solution. Rather, their incompleteness serves a very important function, which can be gleaned from how early Judaism, and early Christianity, I may add, understood the covenant, or the testament between God and his people. The covenant is never a thing of the past, even though it is inscribed in a holy text. But it exists only in the hearer who hears the text anew as his own life story and fulfills it in his own experience of it. The incompleteness of such text as Exodus 19:25 and 21 solicits precisely this hearing practice of integration, and I dare say authorship. A hearing practice in which the hearer becomes the author of the text, which is now new and fresh, as if written or heard for the first time ever. Moreover, incompleteness even serves as a self-destruct safety mechanism, which sets up the holy text to collapse, to become nonsensical in the hands of another life. Or, to speak from our own vantage point, in the hands of a disjointed, observational, or analytical approach. In other words, only one whose life is already inscribed in the covenant will understand the covenant. I would suggest that incompleteness serves the same function in the Byzantine liturgy, which, by the way, learned it from the scriptures themselves, and that the Golden Mouth's prayer of offering is a case in point. Let us move on to the second difficulty on my list. In contrast to incompleteness, in the Byzantine liturgy, examples of bad or non-idiomatic Greek abound. I should mention at this point that I do not use Kini and Greek to indicate the same thing, but rather I take Kini as the language of the Byzantine liturgy, among many other texts, of course, including the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, and I take Greek to indicate the general character, or Greekness, if you wish, of the still extant language whose roots go very deep and very far back in the Proto-Indo-European of prehistory. In other words, Kini is the actuation of this living language in a particular time and place, and Greek is its enduring, although ever-changing essence. Now, despite the frequency of bad Greek in the Byzantine liturgy, surprisingly, but not counterintuitively, the more one is imbued in these Kini texts, And the more one uses them on a regular and familiar basis, together with the Kini scriptures and others, the more one is at a disadvantage in recognizing their bad Greek. An obvious solution here is to look at the text for recognition of what does not belong there naturally, especially to look at them from the vantage point of other forms of Greek, especially Attic, or, of course, the Demotic contemporary to the long life of Kini, but also from the vantage point of Hebrew, Aramaic, Latin, and all the other languages that impacted Kini, particularly in the liturgy and the scriptures. Allow me to focus here on only one example of bad Greek, which is particularly significant for two reasons. It is scripture, bad Greek in the liturgy, I should say. It is scripture, not just liturgy, and it has a striking presence in liturgy. I'm referring to the expression to do, or rather to make mercy, piein eleos. As in English, in Greek too, mercy is not something that is done or made. That is the case only in Semitic languages, and presumably because of very peculiar uses of this tense that Semitic languages have called hifil. The roots of the presence of this non-Greek phrase in the Byzantine liturgy lie in the choice of the Septuagint translator to render a Semitic expression word for word, and of the New Testament and early Christian authors to preserve it intact. Yet, we can tell that the phrase piein eleos, to make mercy, remained strange to an ancient ear, and remained entirely foreign to the inner logic of Greek. It entered neither Demotic speech nor high speech, nor did the ancient Christian writers use it outside of scriptural exegesis or allusions to its scriptural occurrences, except with one exception that I'm aware of, the early monastic literature, the Apophthegmata. Therefore, it is especially significant when the phrase appears in the liturgy. I would submit that the liturgy uses its bad Greek in order to point the liturgizer to the scriptures, or rather to have the liturgy as one and the same space-time as the scriptures. Yet, all the English hieratica that I have consulted in producing my own have decided for an idiomatic English phrase, such as grant mercies, bestow acts of mercy, or impart mercy. Even worse, to my knowledge, without exception, translations of the scriptures, of the Greek scriptures, have produced similarly good English. And now I am asking you this: how is one to detect the scripturalness of the liturgy with such nice and smooth translations? Even more common than non-idiomatic Greek are instances of blunt, rough, or inelegant Greek, probably because in this case, Kini was using its own resources, and this is my third example. My third case of ascetical features of the liturgy. The example I'm presenting to you, I brought up in a recent article, the four participles of the Sanctus, right? Ton epinikion imnon adonda, voonda, kekragoda, kelegonda, which are commonly translated in English as singing the triumphant hymn, shouting, I think, or exclaiming, according to the Greek Archdiocese of the United States, proclaiming and saying. Yet, the beastly connotation of the second and third participles is quite obvious, since they are onomatopoeia. Voao, or voo, imitates the bellowing of oxen, and krazo, the crying of birds. I argued in my article that the participles are a testimony to the ancient visions of Christ's chariot throne as made of tetramorphic cherubim. All these visions are patterned after Ezekiel 1. Each of the four faces of the cherubim, the lion, the ox, the eagle, and the human, offers praise in its natural sound, roaring, mooing, crying, and speaking. Ancient testimonies to this meaning of the participles abound, both textual and iconographic. I review them in my article, so I will spare you that. One of the most explicit is the later text form of Germanos' famous commentary on the Divine Liturgy. Quote, "The triumphant hymn, roaring. Roaring is the eagle. Lowing is the ox. Crying is the lion. And saying is the human." End quote. The author felicitously confuses the sounds of the lion and the eagle. Why do I say felicitously? Because this attests to the wide and early circulation of this interpretation, since the same confusion appears in many other texts and in many icons. 1,000 years later, or even more so, the Anglican priest and hymn writer John Mason Neale attests to the enduring and wide presence of this interpretation, even the same confusion. Some things are very enduring in Orthodoxy, aren't they? Even mistakes. Among the Orthodox of the 19th century that he meets on his travel to Constantinople, quote, the Constantinopolitan ritualist explained that of St. John Chrysostom, of the four evangelists, Adonda is singing, like the eagle. Vonda is bellowing, like the ox. Kekragoda is crying, like the lion. Legonda is speaking, like the man. And this seems a more natural explanation than another, which represents the four quarters of the globe, as referred to in these words, end quote. I agree with him. It is much more natural. Despite the simple naturalness of this explanation of the four participles, as soon as we detect in the liturgy such rough language as animal sounds, we are facing a fundamental question. Do we keep the roughness or do we smooth it out? I would not err on the side of producing a smooth translation, because the loss generated by the elimination of the difficulty is far greater than any of its benefits. The aesthetic must not be preferred over the ascetic. Or rather, to keep a historical tone, preferring the aesthetic over the ascetical is not in the Byzantine tradition itself. The Byzantine tradition has expressed the exceptional value of inelegant language as early as the Dionysian corpus, which I'm in the process of translating, actually. Some, says St. Dionysius the Areopagite, shy away from coarse images for celestial and divine realities. They should not. Not only because this crude imaging of heavenly realities is scriptural, but also because it is particularly mystagogical and accurate precisely because it is coarse and improper. It seems to me that it is this vision attested in the Areopagite which has filled the liturgy with rough Greek. So in deference to it, I decided to keep the bestiality of the participles and translate with roaring, lowing aloud, sounds better than mooing though still, crying out and saying the triumphant hymn. The Byzantine liturgy is rough in many other instances. Lexically, particularly noteworthy are phrases such as "ie empathis necrosis" in the presanctified's first prayer of the faithful, phrase which almost without exception is softened in English translations. I have decided for the equally rough, the rot of the passions. Yet, even more prominent is the roughness of the syntax of the liturgy, which often, for example, produces very long clauses and sentences loaded with distant syntactical links. And in such clauses, the participle construction, often multiplied in long chains, is particularly noticeable, especially if, as it is common actually, it has many words intercalated between the participle and its definite article. There is no clearer indication of the strain that participle constructions place on the Keynote text than the need for the language to resume the subject of such participial constructions with the pronoun once the constructions conclude. Here is an example of a chain of participial constructions in my translation close to the original syntax, namely the beginning of the prayer of the Trisagion. Quote, "Holy God, who rest in the holy place, who are hymned by the seraphim with the thrice holy cry, and glorified by the cherubim, and worshipped by every heavenly power, God of nothing have brought all things into being, who created the human being according to your image and to likeness, and adorned him with every gift of your grace, who give to him who asks wisdom and understanding, and do not overlook the one who sins, but instead have established repentance for salvation, who have counted us, the lowly and your unworthy servants, worthy to stand in this hour before the glory of your holy altar and to offer you due worship and praise." That whole thing was a clause. "Yourself, Master," here's the pronoun. Yourself, Master, receive even from the mouth of us, the sinners. And the prayer goes on. In my opinion, as a matter of a fundamental viewpoint, in front of this syntax, we ought to be aware that the opposite pole from its complexity is not the idiomatic, but the prosaic. Or what a dear friend, fellow priest and professor called very aptly and colorfully to me, the meteorological bulletin. As an example of such prosaicism, here is the same prayer of the Trisagion in a translation which has fixed the syntax. Quote, Holy God, you dwell among the saints. The seraphim praise you with thrice holy voice. The cherubim glorify you. All the powers of heaven adore you. You brought all things into being out of nothingness and created us according to your image and likeness. You grant wisdom and understanding to those who request them. I'll stop here. The translation misses some nuances and elusive but important features in the original text. But even more importantly, this prosaic breaking of the long sentence requires very little or no effort of concentration. And, I would venture to say, the hieratic character of liturgical speech lies precisely in this effort requirement, in this asceticism, as I call it. The hieratic manner of speech, which belongs in front of the holy table, or I should rather say the manner of divine speech, because the Byzantine liturgy recognizes this speech as both being addressed to God and being spoken by God himself. Again, this hieratic manner of speech is not merely a matter of vocabulary or grammar, since actually both vocabulary and grammar are rarely peculiar in their own right, but rather it is first and foremost a matter of fluency, of attitude, and of how vocabulary and grammar are put together. In its fluency, the liturgy expects attentiveness and concentration of both clergy and laity in a process of self-denial, which is ultimately the self-denial of God alone, because only he is capable of such self-denial, and which is by him and in him embodied in his people. This asceticism of God and of his liturgizers is essential. It seems to me that it is a central focus of the composition of the original Keynote text of the liturgy. And in my opinion, it should also be a focus in the work of translation. The translation itself must elicit it. My first example of ambiguity or polyvalence, and we are at my fourth example of difficulties, comes from an area of language to which our postmodern culture shows increased sensitivity. We all know the discussions which are taking place around the issue of gender inclusiveness. It seems to me that in these discussions, the ancient Christian texts, and also ancient Jewish texts, I should add, including the scriptures, are not always understood well. Also, in current debates on the issue, I detect a treatment of language which can only be anachronistic and wrong in relation to these ancient texts. Namely, that language is flat and always means what it says. In contrast to this presupposition, a growing number of studies has recently shown that in ancient Christian and Jewish perceptions, one of the main characteristics of sacred language is that it is not flat at all. It rarely means what it says. Thus, even if one takes issue with the linguistic reality of the masculine being the default gender in Keynote, one cannot ignore the many ancient texts which, on the one hand, point out the avowed arbitrariness and impropriety of the use of masculine language for God, and, on the other hand, emphasize that masculine language can be used inclusively in relation to people. It seems to me that the latter is the case with the use of sons in liturgy, for example. The fourth prayer of Matins asks God that all those present, therefore women included, be shown as, quote, in my translation, sons of light and of day, and heirs of your eternal good things, end quote. Both phrases are scriptural, sons and heirs. Yet, despite their scriptural foundation, there is a clear tendency in recent English translations to render sons in inclusive ways. Whether this change is seen as turning inclusive something which is exclusive or as spelling out an intrinsic inclusiveness, I'm not certain, because I'm not them, and I never asked them. But more often than not, sons becomes children or sons and daughters even. Ironically enough, what such inclusive translations obfuscate is what could be called the Christological inclusivity of the son language, at least according to Galatians 3 and 4 and Ephesians 5. When people are indiscriminately called sons, they are incorporated into Christ, the one true Son and heir. It is in this Christological line that the anaphora of St. Basil calls the Holy Spirit the gift of sonship. This is why, in my opinion, it is essential to translate sons just like that, sons, without any further, I would say, attempts of being inclusive. A more overtly inclusive translation, such as children, can only obscure an inclusion that is already there and is of a higher, truly divine rank. Before my second example of ambiguity and polyvalence, I might say a few words on the oft-repeated and entirely valid observation that one translates with a target. The translation thinks of the ones whom it serves. I have already decried here and on several other occasions and in different venues the attempts to subject Byzantine theology, and by this I understand everything theological, exegesis, doctrine, liturgy, everything, to formalizations, fixations, and systematizations which are fundamentally foreign to it. These inclinations have gained unprecedented traction in recent years as they have come to engender and frame a sort of battle over tradition itself in a spectralization along a liberal conservative axis. And it's, of course, is joined with a lot of politics, unfortunately. In this new manner of being, statements are not only favored over experience, but their traditionality is adjudicated in methodical and abstract ways. I am more traditional than you. And this is, in my opinion, the greatest abandonment of the Byzantine tradition. Not simply the replacement of some ideas with others, neither the abandonment of some practices for others. Such changes happen only in consequence of a deeper, more pervasive shift, which is the supplanting of the very being of tradition, which is internal, physical, ascetical, mystical, soteriological, therapeutic, and eschatological, by formal methods, evaluations, concepts, strategies, arguments, and pronouncements. This pervasive abandonment of the Byzantine manner of being has everything to do with translation. I will give you only one example, although examples abound. The word salvation. Once the word becomes a fixed and formal concept pertaining to heavenly and eschatological realities, within a carefully constructed system of categorical distinctions, how would one not take issue with such liturgical texts as, "All holy birth giver of God, save us"? For all practical purposes, even Father Ephraim Lash of eternal memory, who in my opinion has produced the most splendid liturgical translations into English, gives in to this formalization and fixation of this word when he translates salvation at the end of the petitions, for example, for the sick, the traveling, the imprisoned, with two words, as safety and salvation. By the way, I don't think safety works the way in which Father Ephraim thought it would, because unlike salvation, safety expresses not a need, but rather the absence of it. I think help in salvation would have worked better, but that's just my opinion. Nevertheless, such bifurcation of the Kini word salvation does not reflect the Byzantine reality of Kini, nor ironically the reality of the English language itself. After all, someone in danger of physical harm would have a reasonable expectation to be understood and not to be accused of heresy if that person screams, "Save me." The same is true in Kini. One is saved not only from sin and hell, but also from all kinds of harm. And indeed, the same verb, sozo, is used in the liturgy for all these circumstances. In my opinion, not keeping this Kini polyvalence into an equivalent English polyvalence makes no sense, unless we decide to let go of traditional language in order to accommodate the aforementioned inclination to fix down and formalize that which is not open to fixation and formalization. Now finally, on to spatializing, my fifth and final example of liturgical asceticism. And it is spatializing, as in spatial, not as in spatial. Forgive my accent, it's from Milwaukee. As Professor Nemeth said, I studied there for 6 years. It's not from Romania. What do I mean by spatializing, turning something into a space? Simply put, I have in mind two aspects of the divine liturgy, of the Byzantine liturgy, and already touched on the first one. The first one is the entire reality we call liturgy is in all its dimensions: words, gestures, time, location, direction, chant, icons, candles, etc. Not a flat sum of harmonized but discrete elements, but an integrated and an all-encompassing space-time. And second, all the elements of the liturgy, even if also present somewhere else, and even if historically taken from somewhere else, come together in every moment of the liturgy as into their life, as to the moment for which they are meant, and outside of which they have no existence and meaning. The liturgizer's integration in this reality means that he or she will experience liturgy as the only real space-time of the entire history of the world and of all locations at once, and will not relate to liturgy as to an ultimately discrete and flat reality, as to a conveyor of meanings and teacher of practices. Arguably, this Byzantine liturgical reality is nowhere more visible than at the center of it, the Eucharist. And the lesson is as old as the gospel itself and the Pauline letters. Even though the Eucharist is ultimately Christ, a partaker does not relate to the Eucharist as to something distinct from his or herself. And all the partakings of the Eucharist in all times and places are not distinct from each other, are neither pieces of one larger experience, nor multiplications of the same experience, but rather all partakings of the Eucharist, of all times and of all places, are one and the same partaking as the one given to the apostles by Christ himself, the one single partaking with the entire and same Christ by the entire human self. In my teaching, I often compare the vantage point that this liturgical reality affords the liturgizer to the point of view technique in cinematography. I don't know if you like movies, I like old movies. And this technique always appealed to me. And later on I understood why, because of this. The liturgizer, just as in that technique, the point of view technique means the camera no longer observes the scene from the outside. Let's say, for example, two people that are talking to each other, but actually looks at the other character from the eyes of the second one. It so keeps looking at the characters, and each character stares directly into the camera as they look at each other. Just the same, in Byzantine liturgy, the liturgizer no longer watches any scriptural liturgical event from a distance, as if he were a discrete and observational presence, which is ultimately extrinsic to the scene itself, in a position to draw meanings and lessons from it. But rather, he is all its characters and all its space and all its narrative at once. When it comes to how one translates in view of this reality, this deflattening of a text or story into a three-dimensional space in which the liturgizer finds his life will afford perspectives which otherwise can only be missed. I cannot think of a better example of this spatializing than what happens with the prayer of Simeon, the prayer of the righteous old man, the prayer that the righteous old man says when he takes the baby Christ in his arms in front of the temple. Prayer which is not coincidentally placed at the end of a Byzantine rite. For now, let me quote it in the King James Version. Quote, "Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, according to thy word, for mine eyes have seen thy salvation, which thou hast prepared before the face of all people, a light to enlighten the Gentiles and the glory of thy people Israel." End quote. I wrote on this prayer in a small collection of my talks titled, "Your life will be hung before your eyes, Meanings of Our Life in Orthodox Liturgy." I will not repeat here all the historical evidence presented there in support of my reading of this prayer. Rather, I wish to explain the logic and mechanism behind my reading, which I did not do in that small book, by the way. The three-dimensional presence of this scriptural liturgical event to the liturgizer as a first-hand experience, as his own life, beyond all boundaries of time and space, means that the liturgizer is doing with this prayer precisely what Simeon does. And it would be improper to say did, by the way. At the very moment of this utterance, the liturgizer, Simeon, looks at Christ and asks Christ to bring him death, to let him die. Life after this vision, after this encounter, is an unbearable shackling. And the liturgizer Simeon wants to be free of it. This is a staring at the God-man who is now in humanity's arms, a truly final and fulfilling act of living, act which, it must be repeated, is at once Simeon's and the liturgizer's, between whom now there is no distinction. Given the point which I already made about spatializing, the question of whether this is scripture or liturgy is moot. Thus, in this experience, salvation, light, and glory are titles of Christ, not theological concepts. As most of the parishioners in churches of Byzantine tradition would hear them today, probably due to such translations as the King James. The Byzantine liturgical tradition inscribed this understanding in its hymns, such as in the following hymns, which belong to the Feast of the Meeting, dedicated to this liturgical, scriptural moment, and which is coming soon. Quote, O Simeon, in your embrace receive as a small child the Lord of glory and the salvation of the world. End quote. Second quote. And this is the hymn, the Byzantine hymn, speaking as Simeon/liturgizer. Quote, now set me free, O Master, as you have promised me before. For I have seen you, the pre-eternal light, the Lord and Savior of the people, bearing the name of Christ. End quote. In light of all this, I propose that the meaning of Simeon's words is something along the following lines, which are my translation. Quote, now set free your servant, Master, according to your word in peace. For my eyes have seen your salvation, whom you have prepared before the face of all peoples, light for revelation to the Gentiles, and the glory of your people Israel. And salvation, light, and glory are capitalized. End quote. Instead of an abrupt conclusion, and I think I abused your patience, allow me to make a point which undergirds everything I have said so far. Despite the temptations of our minds to cross, at our own peril, I should add, into formal theological thought, into methods, definitions, and conceptualizations, in the Byzantine world in which all of us present here are interested, and to which many of us belong, there are no such things as the discrete territories of liturgy, scripture, patristics, spirituality, etc. This is not immediately obvious when one undergoes academic studies for a degree in scripture, nor I assume, but I'm not a liturgist, for a degree in liturgy, or when one endeavors to tackle liturgical translation set by such formal preparations. But this is the only view from the vantage point of the liturgy itself. It cannot even be said that the liturgy combines the scriptural, the patristic, the doctrinal, the spiritual, etc., as if these were discrete realities, and the liturgy were a mere point of collection. Rather, the liturgy is a massive monument to the fact that there are no such discrete realities. And in this liturgical space-time, in which Christ is everything, one is made or remade. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Silviu, for, sharpening our eyes for all the dimensions, how liturgy and Holy Scripture belong to each other. Thank you very much. Now we have the possibility for questions. Yeah, there is a question. Please take the microphone.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. Sorry, just in the silence. A very basic question, because I don't remember from your translations. How would you translate philanthropos?
It depends. So sometimes as lover of mankind, sometimes with the verb who loves mankind. Yes. So for example, in the ekphonisis, for you are a good God and love mankind. You know, for o the agathos ke philanthropos theos hyparchis. Right. Yes. Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yes. Well, I am okay with that because I think I think that the title is what it is because of the vision in Byzantine theology, and actually I should also say Jewish theology of the ancient times, the first centuries, that all humanity is one. And it is, God is a lover of us as that one that we are. So I try to avoid any implications. Also, this is the second thing. Many times I try different ways of translating something. Why? So that I can discard certain options immediately. It's a very orthodox thing to do, right? I'm not with them. So, so that it's clear who I am with. And I discarded the singular because it would so easily be taken as preferential, if you want, that God loves certain people or God loves. But I think the expression itself, and if I remember correctly, I have more about this in the 4th volume of the first edition of the books, which is the explanatory volume. The title itself becomes quite common precisely in those theological texts in which humanity is presented as one. It's not a simple question. It's a very good question, thank you. I look rough, and I'm a Transylvanian, but I'm not that, that mean.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Also a very simple question. So you made a very good point for that. There is evidence in the translations that if you see that the roughness of the translation has to be reflect the roughness of the original.
Yes.
Well, what do you do if the original is elegant?
Oh, translated elegantly. That's a very good question,
You
yes.
translate like another of it's a regular which you have, I don't know
Okay.
if you did already, but it's written in a style of Gregory, whereas it will not like Gregory, it's written in a style of Gregory, so it has to be like Gregory. So
Yes.
you have to be, translator has to be, it has to be like a perfect mirror.
Exactly, exactly. Because if we were to translate everything roughly, the value of, well, this philosophy principle, translation principle itself would lose its meaning, right? The rough text would basically disappear, dissipate into this sea of roughness. And roughness only works if it is not universal. So it's only striking because it is not constant. Yes, so that's my principle. What worries me, it was, first, of course, this was the case with scriptural text. Even before I learned Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic and Latin and anyway, these languages, every time I read a scriptural translation that was perfectly smooth throughout. I always had doubts about it, because very rarely, and this is not true only about scriptural text, but probably any text we produce, probably with the exception of the phone book, as Father Ephraim Lash famously put it, and maybe newspaper articles. We generally produce texts that are at times rough. Why would an English translation, accurate English translation of the scriptures, would be always perfectly smooth? Same thing goes for the liturgy. So that's what I would say. Rough text should be translated roughly, and smooth text translated smoothly. And mark that difference. Yeah, that the difference has to be markedly obvious. Yes. So it's not a simple question. It's a great question. Thank you. There was another question further back. Oh.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for them.
It was seducing. If I wouldn't have been already an Orthodox, I would say now I want to become an Orthodox. Byzantine Orthodox.
It's the Transylvanian in me, and it's late at night. That was my one joke that I was allowed.
We are almost at the end of our conference, our workshop, and the title of our workshop is the difference between the lived Byzantine liturgy and the local context. Difference between the ideal situation of standard books and what we are actually doing. And 2 days we looked mostly at negative sides, let's say. I don't want to push you now in this direction of my interest of anti-Jewish elements of the Byzantine liturgy. We can completely ignore this. But have you ever found something negative? Because everything sounds so positive, of course. This is the reason, because I am Orthodox believer, cleric. But have you ever met some discontinuity or negative elements in your work?
Another simple question. Yes, well, okay, not necessarily negative, but distressing, yes. Or rather, I would put it this way. I have come across texts that would have been distressing to me if we had not had the saints. But for me, the experience of Orthodoxy is first and foremost, as I try to argue, is not an experience on paper. It's not an experience that is gathered in the process of translation. Is the experience in the personal encounter with the holy person. And I've met holy people in my life. And if these texts were able to produce them, I'm fine with them. And I'm mindful of the fact that probably I have, well, not probably, certainly I have a very, very, very long way to go to be so undisturbed by them as they are, by this text as these holy people are. To be perfected by this text as they are, as these holy people are. So it's that encounter with the holy person that puts my worldly and instinctual inclinations, if you want, aside pretty quickly. Faces come to my mind, including that of my great-grandmother, who was an extraordinary Christian. If she read that scriptural text every day, and she was reading every day, she was very literate, but reading every day, and she stayed in church throughout all those hymns, and yet she was the person that she was, I'm fine with them. With all those texts, I would even say that it's my problem because of that experience. So, anyway, thank you. And I think there were 2 more hands up, but I don't remember who.
What do you do with new You're a new lover.
I haven't got there yet.
It's a lot.
Yes.
What do you think about
Eventually, I will have to stop. So, okay, I will confess that right now I've just finished the Liturgicon of Simon Petra, and I started translating the Ephologion, the 4 volumes. And probably when I'll be done with the 4 volumes, I'll stop. Because I'm also translating the Fathers, so I'm in the process of translating St. Dionysius, and also producing a translation together with Archbishop Alexander of the first collection of the homilies of Macarius. I need to stop, and I have so many other projects. I won't get there. So the question is daunting. Or you mean in terms that they produce so many rough texts? I see. The quality of the new hymnography. I have to tell you, I don't know it. So I only experience it in translation, as I hear it in my own parish. I've never looked at the original. Sometimes the translations do not sound good to me. But I'm happy to pass down this problem to future generations. I'm perfectly content to say, it's your problem. Because I can only do so much, I understand. So what do we do with the difficulties of the new things? Oh, thank God it's not my problem. As an old priest used to put it, not my problem. But it is a problem. I have no idea how the Lord will deal with it through us. I trust the future of the church because she's not ours. She has another bridegroom, thank God. Yeah. And there was another question. Yeah. Father Alexandro, please.
Again, thank you. I like very much how you speak and that we allow to speak like this in these rooms, this university. Some of your colleagues or former colleagues in the United States, professors for Judaistic Jewish literature and Old Testament and theology, like Nikolai Rodi or they wrote something like this articles that sometimes the Byzantine liturgy not only interprets is not always one with the scripture, but sometimes the liturgy obscures the scriptures by putting, for example, very important parts of biblical text in a shadow, in a corner, and letting other biblical texts be read on Sunday. My example, because I'm interested in this Jewish, is that in Romans chapter 11, for example, we hear from Apostle Paul that Israel will be saved. But this text is never heard by the faithful in the church because it's appointed to be read during the week, always. And you don't have so many believers attending the liturgy during the week. But on the Sunday, you will hear on Sunday, in Romans 10, verse 4, Christos telmos tumon. And this is very well known content of the wisdom of the Romans, and all the Orthodox believers are familiar with this because they hear this on Sunday liturgy, and they don't hear other parts of the same epistle. So that's why the professors they speak about obscuring and sometimes also about subverting the message of the Apostle Paul and other parts of the Scripture. What are you telling us about this? Thank you.
Another simple question. I think there's a general answer, and probably there is a more specific answer. The answer is that actually the obscuring of the scriptures is a very scriptural thing to do. And that is because the framework of the scriptures, which is the same thing as the framework of the liturgy, is ascetical. So in other words, there's only one purpose, our growth. And part of our growth is an intrinsic part of growing, not hearing things too soon or too much. So it is because of this ascetical, all-encompassing ascetical framework that a lot of this obscuring happens. Now, in this particular case, the general answer does not suffice. I wouldn't be as suspicious as some others would be that this partition of the epistles was intentional. What actually, and I think the historical evidence, but again, I'm not a liturgist, so I'd appeal to the actual liturgists in the room. I'm more of a philosopher of liturgy, if you want. But the script, if I recall correctly, my little education liturgy, the historical evidence points that the governing principle of the parting of the apostle is actually to match the gospel. And this is quite obvious the moment they stop matching with the Lucan jump, right? It's in some traditions, about which we heard actually these last 2 wonderful days. So I'm not sure there's a conspiracy there. There's something intentional, but I'm not sure the intentionality has to do with we don't want people to hear that, we only want people to hear that Christ is the fulfillment of the law. And we'll assign that for Sundays. It's rather a match, which is much more complex than that. And it has to do with the growth of the liturgizer. And by the way, by liturgizer, I don't understand the priest or the deacon or the bishop, but everyone present in the liturgy. So I wouldn't suspect something nefarious there. Is there a solution? Should we move the apostles to Sundays? Well, my answer is already pointing to a difficulty. We're talking about things that are matched, right? So imagine how wonderful it is that actually our tradition looks at the apostle being, if you wish, the book, but all the apostolic texts in the New Testament, and sees another gospel. That vision is extraordinary, and I wouldn't come anywhere near it for being afraid to break this wonderful porcelain thing, right, object of beauty. So, and for many reasons, actually, I'm concerned about liturgical committees and commissions. I would not touch the practice. On the other hand, I think your question, Father, points to a great necessity in today's orthodoxy, which is to give sermons that are impactful beyond blatant and tired historical facts. In the sermon, to give sermons which actually continue and embody, and in a way, if you want, not systematize, I don't like systematics. Anything systemic and systematic, I have an instinctual, concern with. But to encapsulate, if you want, this growth purpose of the liturgy itself. So if people don't understand what is actually meant by Christ as the fulfillment of the law, and this is how I translate it, not as, or completion of the law, if you want, not the bypassing of the law, that's not the sense of it, that's not what St. Paul is talking about, right? Then I think a lot of fault lies squarely on us, who give sermons on things which are, and by the way, and that's an ascetical reality, it's a spiritual reality. It's not a doctrinal reality. Before it is doctrinal, before it is anything, it has to be true here, deep in the human heart. And if people don't know that, it's our fault. So we want to fix it with books? Fine. Then we'll have required reading lists in our parishes. What will we do with the books? See, I'm peasant stock myself. And I think the power of the spoken word, especially in such contexts as the sermon, will always be far greater than any book. Well, probably that's also an apostolic thing to do, because the apostles, the early Christians, the apostles themselves, the early Christians had an instinctual opposition to put things on paper. Well, okay, not paper back then, but it would be paper today. They wanted something personal. They wanted something interactive. They wanted contact. And we have this opportunity. And what do we do with it in our sermons? So teach the people. Let us teach the people. Let us catechize them in many different ways. Let us, for example, reestablish the ancient practice that if we have catechetical classes for converts, well, I function in a space which mostly deals with converts. A lot of people join the Orthodox Church in the States. Let's require their sponsors to go through the program together with the catechumens. There are many different ways to do before we go to we even think of the option of changing existing practice. Have we done everything we could possibly do with the gifts we already given? I don't think we have even started to use the gifts we already given properly, to use them well. And what's required probably is not even so much education on our part as much as holiness. It comes down to prayer. Anyway, sorry.
Still some minutes left. Someone already asked the second question, and it came up in the conference a little bit. One of the speakers mentioned it, but we never were able to follow up. And since you have such a biblical and patristic vision of the life of the church in the liturgy, let me ask a very mundane question. Copyright. So you've done these liturgical translations that are rough and trying to present the faith of the church. And I understand people have to live from something, so you can't just give it away for free, but is it possible to just take your translations and reuse them and spread them? And I don't mean to modify them, but to use them if you're convinced this is the best, or do you think that then each one should have their own kind of translation, because it's a translation rather than the original text? So if you could comment on the diffusion of texts.
The diffusion of text. Well, to speak for my own translation, it's not my decision to make. I'm not the only one that's part of this. I'm part of a group of people. And if we take the question more broadly, I don't know what to say. I really don't know what to say. It is liturgy. It ought to be known as widely as possible. Indeed. I agree with the presupposition of your question entirely, Father. Yes. I'm sorry, disseminated more widely, yes. It is, of course I could see though a negative side to that too. It is, because, okay, so here is the first negative aspect of disseminating things just so freely that comes to mind, because it was one of my concerns, and it was actually voiced years ago when I started the project by someone directly to my face. Oh, not another liturgical translation. Right. One thing certainly I didn't intend, and I think I speak for Father Matthew Peter too, and of course Archbishop Alexander also, we didn't intend to add to the noise produced by so many translations. Also, we didn't want to take over basically the English-speaking Orthodox world. And the idea was not to produce something perfect. The idea was rather to add our voices to the existing voices for the purpose of a future translation, which is the translation of all, or at least that's a U.S. Orthodoxy, in maybe decades from now. So if anything, we have produced fertilizer. That's the way I see it. For the future generations to put their roots into and to be fed by. So that someone 50 years from now, 80 years from now, God knows when, will produce just the text that all the other churches will nod to. That's all we want. So I can see that's the first negative aspect of this free proliferation of translation that I can think of. It's the more upfront it is, the more pushy we could be. I think it steps away from the field where it belongs, where it's intended to be, into the field of cacophony. That would worry me. Yes. Father Chrysostom, is then another question in the back? Yes, please.
Thank you very much for the
Thank you.
presentation and your work. A question about the base text.
Mhm.
Whereas you offer new approaches to the translation, I think that you don't question the base text at all. Is that correct? And if it is correct, is that something that was decided once and for all, or is it something that will perhaps be reconsidered in the future, either because of a new version of the Simonopatra edition, or based on certain scholarship outcomes?
Thank you, Father, for the question. It is only a new version of Simon Petra that could convince me to produce something else, because this is very personal to me. This is all about Geronda Emilianos. See, some people were arguing to me that they are probably, arguably, maybe, I don't know, I'm not a specialist, I'm not a historian of the liturgy, better texts to translate. They're not better to me. I have, through my own spiritual father, a direct connection to the monastery of Simon Petra. I didn't go for their text for any scholarly reasons whatsoever. And I will stay with them. Indeed, maybe a few times, a handful of times in each volume, for example, the Eratikonon, the Diakonikon, the Siliturgikon too, will be true for the Siliturgikon also. We depart from the text, we think that alternative practices should be mentioned, and we always mark them in brackets and of course footnotes, but because the books are for liturgical use, we have to keep those to a minimum. So I myself don't always agree with what they say, but they are nevertheless special to me. It's not, so this work is not in that sense, my option, my choice to translate the Simon Petra books is not a scholarly choice, it's a very personal choice. So someone asked me straightforwardly, would you be interested in translating the Vatopedi work? Why would I do that? First and foremost, I'm not a liturgist, and I had that disclaimer at the very beginning, so I don't do this to, I don't know, further the field of liturgy, of liturgical studies. I did it just because I wanted that connection, and I'm holding on to it. So yeah, I hope that answers your question, Father, but to me, it's very personal. It's entirely personal, I should say. Yes, but we do mark, as I said, alternative texts, alternative practices. For example, we mentioned these last 2 days, having the participle in the offering your own of your own, right? we did go with the participle rather than the indicative we offer, present tense, in our translation. But we put it in brackets with the footnote saying the Simon Petrarch books actually have the indicative present tense. We offer, not offering. But we kept those to a minimum, yes, because the text is very special, both to myself and to Father Matthew Peter, and to, of course, to Archbishop Alexander, because he was tonsured by Hieronymous. So that's why the Simon Petrarch books. Well, I draw a lot of comfort that they are still seen, like yourself, Father, presented by many people as the books to use. So that's wonderful. That gives me great joy. Yeah. And there was, yes, a question all the way in the back. I think it was the gentleman all the way in the back. There, yes.
Thank you very much for your very interesting lesson.
Thank you.
I'm very happy that I had to make me friend of the Orthodox Church. And we have here in Vienna a lot of Orthodox churches. And therefore also the possibility of to visit the Holy Liturgy, for example, the tradition of Marius Chrysostomos and Marius Basilius and the Greek Church and the Russian Church and the Roman Church and the Romanian Church and so on. But we have also here the Monastery of Zurich, the community of the Christian Church in Egypt, in Georgia, in Armenia, and so on. And I'm very happy that I have the possibility now to visit the liturgies, and I already know that the tradition in Greece and Russia and so on have the tradition from Byzance, and they mainly have the tradition of Jerusalem. For example, my private short question to release, what do you prefer? Thank you.
Oh, what do I prefer? That's a very important question because looking at my own life, I don't think I ever made a choice. I do my faith somewhat more peasant style, pretty much the way I learned to walk. I still do it today the way, I don't know, I breathe, or my heart pumps blood. And either way, as an East European, I don't value choice and free will that much. And I don't worry about having choices. I worry about not being free, which is an entirely different thing. So, yes, it's not a preference. I belong to this church because I belong to this church. That's as simple as it is to me. Yes, I didn't choose it. It chose me in a way. And I'll stick with it. Yes. I love the beauty of other traditions. Absolutely. Absolutely. And even that's not a matter of choice. Beauty is not quite a matter of choice. Yeah, that's not. There isn't much choice in that either, if you ask me. But yes, thank you. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for everything, for having me.
For the conversation and